The Constitution, Lecture 9. In the last lecture, I talked about federalism and about Article 4 of the Constitution. In this lecture, we get to Article 5, which is concerned with amending the Constitution. You might ask, why would you want a procedure for changing your fundamental laws? Now, it's not because that's what amending the Constitution means, insofar as insofar as the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Amending the Constitution means amending or changing the fundamental laws of your society, either adding something or taking something out or altering something that is there. Why would you want to do that? Now, it's not because the framers thought that the fundamental principles and tasks of government would change. They believed that it is more or less timelessly true that that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the governed, and that it must protect the life, liberty, and property, and religious liberty, for that matter, of its citizens. So it wasn't that they didn't have a procedure for amending the Constitution in there because they thought that the fundamental principles of government were going to evolve. That's why all this, the idea of natural rights, that if these rights are your natural rights, that means as long as you're a human, you have these rights. Natural rights don't evolve, they don't change. So the amendment procedure is not about the ends of government, but it's more about the means of government. Because even if they thought the principles of government had been discovered and were fixed and unchanging, the environment within which government takes place can still change. It could be over time that, technological advances or population changes or other social changes could make it so that in order to achieve its fundamental tasks, there needed to be alterations to the Constitution. Just to give one example, I guess it might be a little bit controversial. Just give one example would be that at the time of the founding, most citizens approved of the Senate being chosen not by direct election, but by state legislatures. But by the late 19th century, there was a kind of groundswell of opinion that this was leading to a corrupt Senate, that too many people were using their money to basically bribe state legislators into giving them a seat in the Senate. So people were fine with the Senate being elected by state legislatures, but at a certain point, a critical mass of the population decided that it would be better for senators to be directly elected. And so they amended the Constitution so that it could be done that way. It's also the case that since, when the Constitution is being written in 1787 in Philadelphia, this is a new form of government. There are many, even though a lot of it is drawing upon colonial experience and a lot of it is drawing upon the English political tradition, it's still the case that at the national level, there was a lot of stuff that was brand new, and they could only speculate about how it would function. It's like the office of president, the electoral college, things like that. There really were no real precedents for that in the past. And so they were quite well aware that there might be things in the Constitution that they didn't quite get right. There tends to be a lot of reverence for the Constitution today, but the framers were there, right? And they made it, and they knew that there were a lot of compromises built into the Constitution. They knew that there were limits to their knowledge and their imagination, and so they recognized that, there might be times where flaws in the Constitution are exposed, and you don't want to be stuck with a flawed Constitution if there's a way to improve it, right? So the Constitution has to have a mechanism within it to make orderly change of the Constitution itself possible. There must be some established mechanism for altering its terms when existing provisions prove to be inadequate or faulty. So that's why you need to be able to amend the Constitution. Case in point, mentioned it before, the 12th Amendment. Right, the 12th Amendment changed the way that the president and the vice president were elected. According to Article 2, Section 1, originally the vice president was simply the person who came in second in the presidential vote. But that meant, for example, that in 1796, Thomas Jefferson became John Adams' vice president, even though the two were political enemies. Right? So the person who comes in that case, the person who came in second was the rival of the person who came in first. That's not a good way since the vice president is there to kind of step in if the president is incapacitated, it's not a good idea to have political opponents or enemies, party enemies, in that kind of situation. And then there was I won't get into it, but the Jeffersonian electors came up with a kind of a scheme in 1800 that was meant to make it so that Jefferson would come in first, Burr would come in second, and John Adams would come in third, because their thinking was, we don't like the Federalists, we don't like John Adams, we want us Jeffersonians to be in charge of the government. But that means, with regard to the presidential election, not only do we want Jefferson to come in first, but we don't want Adams to be the vice president either. So we've got to make it so that somebody else comes in second. And so they had this, since each elector cast 2 votes, basically Jeffersonian electors kind of came up with a scheme where everybody agreed they would cast 1 vote for Jefferson and 1 vote for Burr, except one person who was supposed to throw their vote for Burr to somebody else. And that way, Burr got 1 vote less than Jefferson. So Jefferson would come in first, and Burr would come in second, Adams would come in third and have to go back to Massachusetts. But whoever was supposed to throw, as I recall, whoever was supposed to throw their vote away so that Jefferson would have a 1-vote lead forgot to. And so you ended up with Jefferson and Burr being tied. And it was just all a big mess. And so they say, you know what, why don't we just change it so that there's a separate vote for president and vice president, so we don't have to do this kind of elaborate balancing act again. So this is a clear example of how, when they were designing the Electoral College, there had never been anything like that before. So they designed something that they thought would work, but then in doing it and trying it out, they recognized, oops, some aspects of this don't work very well, so let's amend the Constitution and change them. Obviously, the most famous examples, I think, of constitutional amendments are the first 10 amendments, which are the Bill of Rights, which were passed in the early 1790s. Many opponents to the Constitution, during the time when the Constitution was being debated, many opponents to the Constitution, one of their main objections is they said this proposed Constitution has no Bill of Rights, right? We had the English Bill of Rights, our state constitutions have bills of rights. Why shouldn't the federal Constitution have a Bill of Rights too? Even Jefferson raised that objection from Paris. So this was a broad objection, and Hamilton and Madison did not think that a Bill of Rights was necessary. They actually thought a Bill of Rights was a bad idea. Madison wrote a few letters to Jefferson explaining why. Hamilton, there's a Federalist paper, one of the very last Federalist papers, where Hamilton explains why he doesn't think a Bill of Rights is necessary. But at the end of the day, prominent politicians such as James Madison basically started making a promise and saying, look, okay, if you guys ratify this proposed Constitution, we promise to add a Bill of Rights to it. So it was a kind of a deal. Like, if we promise to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, will the Constitution be acceptable to you? And enough people said, yes, that's enough. That this promise to add a Bill of Rights was the thing that really kind of ensured that the Constitution be ratified. So, being men of their words, as soon as the new Congress convened, Madison and some others went to work drawing up a proposed Bill of Rights. And some of those proposals end up being the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. So, you can see why, oops, okay, our countrymen really want a Bill of Rights, so let's add one. So you can see why you would want to have some provision for being able to alter the Constitution. So that's what's laid out in Article 5. And the first thing to note about Article 5 is that amending the Constitution is a 2-step process. There is proposal and there is ratification. In other words, there has to be some official procedure whereby changes to the Constitution can be officially proposed, right? Some way of officially making propositions. It can't just be any old person saying, hey, I think the Constitution should be changed in X, Y, or Z way. Like, that's not enough to make it an official proposal. So there has to be a procedure for officially proposing changes to the Constitution. But then once proposals have been made, there also has to be an official process for either accepting or rejecting those proposed changes. And that's the ratification stage. So ratification is about either accepting or rejecting a proposed amendment. So it's kind of, I think, sometimes it's kind of like when somebody proposes marriage, right? Just because you propose, in order to get married, you got to propose to somebody, right? Or somebody has to be proposed to. So there's got to be a proposal. But just proposing to somebody doesn't then make you automatically married, because the other person has to say, yes, I will, or no, I won't. So you've got proposal, got to make the proposition, and ratification, where it's either accepted or rejected. So Article 5 lays out two steps. the steps for proposing an amendment, and the steps for ratifying an amendment. And in fact, each of those steps itself has two ways of doing things. There are two different ways of proposing changes to the Constitution and two different ways of ratifying changes to the Constitution. So let us move first to proposition, the ways of proposing constitutional amendments. The first way, and the only way that's ever been done so far, is if 2/3 of the House, so a supermajority, and 2/3 of the Senate both sort of vote for a proposed amendment. So that's, for example, how, like the Bill of Rights is proposed. So for example, the First Amendment is written up and is submitted to a vote in the House, and at least 2/3 of the people in the House say, yes, that sounds like a good amendment, and at least 2/3 of the people in the Senate say, yes, that sounds like a good amendment. Once 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, or basically 2/3 of Congress, have approved a proposed amendment, it is considered officially proposed. It is now officially on the table as a potential amendment. So that's the way that all amendments so far have been proposed. But there is an alternative way. And the reason why, if you think about it, is this. You don't want to give Congress sole power over proposing amendments, because what if the situation is that the American people have decided, for example, that Congress has grown too powerful, and so they want to propose an amendment restricting the powers of Congress? The thinking was there's no way that Congress is going to propose an amendment that weakens the powers of Congress. But nonetheless, if there is a genuine national opinion that this is a good idea to do, there needs to be a way to make sure that Congress cannot simply block proposed amendments because they don't like it. So there's a second way, but the second way is a little bit different. And that's where if 2/3 of state legislatures, so the legislatures from 2/3 of the states, they can call for a convention. So the state legislatures don't actually propose amendments. What they do is they pass a resolution saying, we want there to be a national convention whose purpose is to generate possible amendments to the Constitution. So an amending Constitution. This is what's referred to as a convention of the states. And so for that to happen, again, the legislatures of 2/3 of the states have to call for such a convention. And if they do, then what would happen is there would be, a place would be picked, and each state would send a delegation of representatives, and those representatives would meet in a convention, and they would debate, and then the end result of the convention would be one or more proposed amendments. And so that would be the other way that you can propose amendments to the Constitution. That way has never been done. But again, once an amendment has been proposed, that's just proposal. You're not done yet, right? Now it's on the table, but we still have to see whether the American people accept or reject that proposed amendment. So that's the ratification stage. The first and most hugely important, so note this because students always forget about this or don't notice this. In fact, it is very, very rare that I've ever had a student that can correctly describe both ways of proposing and both ways of ratifying a constitutional amendment. So, in terms of the exam and the quiz, I challenge you to be one of them. But the important thing to know about ratification is that the federal government, the government in DC, is totally not involved in the ratification stage. The federal government has no power to ratify a proposed amendment. And this is very important because think about it. Congress has the power to propose amendments. If Congress also had the power to ratify amendments, then guess what? The Congress can make the Constitution say whatever it wants it to say. At that point, instead of the people being sovereign through the Constitution, Congress will become sovereign. Congress can propose an amendment saying, hey, we propose that all currently serving members of Congress be given aristocratic titles and hold their office for life and pass their office down to their children. right? So they could propose an amendment to the Constitution creating a hereditary aristocracy. And then they could turn around, if they had the power to ratify, they could then turn around and say, yes, what a great idea, Congress. We ratify it. And at that point, boom, you've got, whether the American people want it or not, a handful of people in Washington, D.C. have transformed a republic into a hereditary aristocracy. You don't want that to happen. So although it makes sense for the federal government to have the power to propose amendments, you don't want the federal government to have the power to ratify, because if you did, then the federal government has unilateral power to alter the Constitution. And what that means then is that it's actually the office holders in the federal government who are the sovereign, not the people at large. And let me mention, this is kind of the theory of sovereignty. The Constitution begins with the phrase, we the people, implying or stating that the people of the United States are the ultimate source of political authority. That's what a sovereign is. The sovereign is the ultimate source of political authority. In like a divine right monarchy or something like that, the sovereign is the divinely appointed king. The king is the ultimate source of authority, and everybody else is subordinate. Popular sovereignty is where the people are the ultimate source of authority, and everybody and all else is subordinate to that. But of course, in a republican system, in a representative democracy, the people do not govern directly, right? We, the people, don't do hardly anything politically, right? We, the people, don't write laws. We don't pass laws. We don't execute laws. I mean, really about the only thing, politically speaking, that we, the people, do is occasionally serve for jury duty, and when we feel like it, vote. But beyond that, we, the people, we don't directly govern ourselves. Rather, popular sovereignty works this way. The people are sovereign, and they express their ultimate authority by adopting a constitution. So the Constitution gets its authority from the fact that it has been approved by the people. So the people adopt a constitution. That constitution, which the people have adopted, lays out a frame of government and the rules for, the powers of government and how people are chosen for office. So what the people adopt a constitution, and then the constitution dictates how the government can run. And then the people who actually hold office under the Constitution, they are meant to exercise their power in accordance with what the Constitution says they can do. And the Constitution has the right to tell them what to do because the Constitution has been approved by the people, who are the ultimate source of authority. So the people, the Constitution, and then the federal government. Those are the layers of authority. So the federal government itself is supposed to operate under the rules of the Constitution. But if the federal government had the power to rewrite the Constitution, then actually it'll be the federal government that is the ultimate source of authority and not the people at large. So in order to safeguard the sovereignty of the people, you must make sure that the government must abide by the Constitution and doesn't have the power to rewrite it unilaterally. So for that reason, although the federal government through Congress can propose amendments, it cannot ratify amendments. All ratification is done at the state level, state by state. And again, there are two ways of ratifying an amendment. So let's say 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate has proposed the First Amendment. How do we know whether or not that amendment is adopted? Well, you have a ratification process. And one of the ways that a proposed amendment can be ratified is if legislatures from 3/4 of the states approve the amendment. So I don't know what 3/4 of 50 is, but a supermajority of state legislatures. Yeah, because remember, these state legislatures are understood to be representative of the people of their state. So, the Texas state legislature, when it comes to constitutional amendments, the Texas state legislature speaks on behalf of the people of Texas. And, the argument is that makes sense because the state legislature of Texas is elected by the people of Texas to represent them. And one of the functions of state governments, according to the Constitution, is either to accept or to reject proposed changes to the Constitution. So if legislatures from 3/4 of the 50 states approve a proposed constitutional amendment, then it becomes a part of the Constitution. The Constitution is officially changed. And that is the way that all constitutional amendments, except one, have been adopted. And there's a second way of ratifying a constitutional amendment. And to see why, think about it this way. Think of the logic this way. What if the proposed constitutional amendment, what if the people of the United States broadly have decided that there are certain powers that are currently exercised by the state governments, but they think those powers should be taken away from the states and exercised by the federal government instead? Let's say you have a scenario like that. Like we want to transfer a power from the state governments to the federal government. Like let's say sometime in the future, the American people decide we want all education policy to be made in Washington, D.C., and we don't want local school boards or states to make any of the rules regarding education. I mean, that'll never happen, but just as a hypothetical, let's say they decide that we want to get rid of the power of the states to shape education policy and give it entirely to the federal government. You can be pretty positive that a proposed amendment like that would be rejected by the state legislatures, because not because it's necessarily against the common good, but because state legislatures are unlikely to ratify proposed amendments that would cause state legislatures to lose power. Nonetheless, there might be circumstances where some kind of constitutional amendment like that would be for the broad general good, and it could be broadly popular with the people. So in the same way that you don't want the federal Congress to be able to block proposed constitutional amendments, and so that's why you have the possibility of the convention of the states, you don't want the self-interest of state politicians to be able to block ratification of proposed amendments. So Congress, when it proposes an amendment, can stipulate that instead of this amendment being ratified by the state legislatures, it has to be ratified by specially called conventions in each of the states. And this is something that happened with the Constitution itself. When the Constitution was proposed, each state held a little ratification convention where representatives were sent or elected, and they debated the merits of the proposed Constitution and either decided to accept or reject it. So it wasn't the state legislatures that ratified the Constitution. It was specially called conventions in each state. And so that's the other option for amending the Constitution too, that instead of having the state legislatures approve a proposed amendment, you can have a specially called convention to debate the proposed amendment and either accept it or reject it. And the only time that that's been done is with the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. So when Congress proposed an amendment repealing the prohibition on the sale of alcohol, they stipulated in the proposed amendment that this amendment has to be ratified by specially called conventions and not by state legislatures. And I assume the reason why is because probably the pro-prohibition lobby was pretty influential and had a lot of money in a lot of state houses and at the state level in a lot of governments. And so they didn't want the prohibition lobby to be able to block the repeal of prohibition through their financial influence over state legislators. So instead, there's a specially called convention, and of course it passed, and prohibition was repealed. And remember, the only part of the Constitution that's still there that cannot be amended is that states can't be deprived of their equal standing in the Senate without their own consent. Right? And this is a bulwark of federalism. So just one last thing to note. You might say, wow, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose an amendment, and then you need legislatures from 75% of the states in order to approve an amendment. It's really hard to amend the Constitution. And you're right, and that's deliberate. Since the Constitution is the fundamental law of the land, the framers believed that it must be very stable, that it would be very bad for the Constitution to be subject to constant change because of how disruptive constant change of the Constitution could be to society. The Constitution needs to be stable. The way you make it stable is by setting a high bar that has to be met to propose any change, because the fact that you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose an amendment and legislatures of 3/4 of the states to approve it means that there are a lot of proposed amendments that just never even make it out of the proposal stage. And that's deliberate. But on the other hand, the thing I want to note is that oftentimes when the need for a particular amendment has broad popular approval, it's actually possible to amend the Constitution pretty fast. So it's a high bar, but if a proposed amendment is really popular, that does not stand in the way of the change being made. And the proof is that we've changed the Constitution, right? The Bill of Rights was adopted very quickly. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War were adopted pretty quickly. There were a slew of amendments adopted fairly quickly in the early 20th century. So it's a high bar, but when a proposed amendment is genuinely popular across the country, that bar is actually pretty easy to meet. So that's all I have to say about amending the Constitution. I'm going to have another few lectures that talk about Articles 6 and 7 and then talk about constitutional amendments. So with that, I'll start that with the next lecture.